The story of Christmas is told and retold every year. In films and TV shows, in songs and hymns, in school nativity plays, it's in paintings and statues and displays in church. It's one of the most famous stories in the world. But if we look carefully, it turns out we know a lot less about the birth of Jesus than we thought. The story we're told goes something like this. An angel tells Mary that she's pregnant with the Son of God. She and her husband, Joseph, travel from their hometown of Nazareth to Bethlehem. There's no room at the inn, so they bed down in a stable where Jesus is born, amidst the cows and the sheep and the little donkey. The shepherds are out watching their flocks by night when an angel appears and tells them all about it. So they come and praise Jesus. Meanwhile, 3 wise men are seeking the newborn king by following a star in the sky, which leads them to the stable. They give Jesus gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh for some reason, and everyone worships Jesus under the starlight, even the little donkey. But here's the thing. When we look at the Gospels, there's not one, but 2 nativity stories, one in the Gospel of Matthew and the other in the Gospel of Luke, and they're completely different. Let's look at the story in the Gospel of Matthew first. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. No explanation given. Presumably that's where his parents live. Sometime later, perhaps a couple of years, a group of magi, Persian astrologers, come looking for him, having seen Jesus' star rising in the sky. But they are not very discreet. They stop off with King Herod, the king of the Jews, and they ask him, "Have you heard about this new king of the Jews that's just been born?" Herod, being the actual king of the Jews, is not too keen on the idea of a rival, but he sends them on their way and asks them to let him know where this infant king is, just so he can pay his respects, you understand. The Magi then follow the star to a house in Bethlehem, where they find Jesus and his mother. We're not told anything about this house, so it's presumably the family home that Jesus was born in. They give him gifts, and then presumably get put up for the night because they have a dream that warns them not to go back to Herod. So they just slip off home. Herod is not so easily outwitted, though. He knows from the Magi that this new king was born somewhere around Bethlehem, sometime in the last 2 years. So he orders all the male children in the area under 2 to be killed. But Jesus isn't there anymore. The angel of the Lord came to Joseph in a dream and told him to take his wife and child to Egypt to escape Herod's slaughter. Too bad for all the other kids. Jesus and his family stay in Egypt until they hear that Herod is dead, and then head back home. But when they hear that Herod's son is now on the throne, they decide that Judea is still a bit hot for them, so they go north into Galilee and settle down in a town called Nazareth. There's no hint that they've ever been there before, and indeed they go there precisely because they hope no one will look for them there. That's Matthew's story. There's no journey to Bethlehem, no overcrowded inn, no stable, no shepherds, no little donkey. Jesus is born in Bethlehem because that's where his parents live, and he ends up in Nazareth because his parents need to keep him far away from Jerusalem, where he might be killed. But the story in the Gospel of Luke is quite different. In Luke's version, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. Mary gets pregnant, but as ill luck would have it, the Emperor Augustus orders a census of all the Roman world, and for some reason everyone has to go to their hometown to register. It so happens that Joseph's hometown is Bethlehem, the very place where the Messiah is prophesied to be born. So they trek down to Bethlehem. There's no guest room available, so Mary ends up giving birth to Jesus and placing him in a manger. There's nothing here about an innkeeper or a stable. In fact, there's no details about the context of this manger at all. But historically, livestock were often kept in caves, so early tradition supposed that Luke was talking about a stone trough for feeding cattle, carved into the inside of a cave, somewhere around Bethlehem. An angel appears to some shepherds, who are out at night watching their flocks, much to their astonishment. The angel tells them that the Messiah has been born, and is currently wrapped in cloths in a manger in Bethlehem. The shepherds go to see Jesus and Mary, and are terribly excited and go around telling everyone they can. 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised. Mary and Joseph take him to Jerusalem, to the temple, to carry out the appropriate rituals of purification and sacrifice. There they meet a devout man who blesses them and praises God, and an elderly female prophet who gives thanks to God and goes around telling everyone she can find all about Jesus, the newborn Messiah. Their business concluded, the Holy Family toddle peacefully back home to Nazareth, although they do make sure to come back to Jerusalem every year for Passover. That's Luke's story. No wise men, no star, no gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Also no Herod and no slaughter of the innocents. Far from being in hiding, Jesus and his family are quite happy going back and forth to Jerusalem and having everyone talking all about them. It's not just that these stories don't contain the same incidents. They are fundamentally incompatible. The only thing they have in common is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem and ends up in Nazareth. In Matthew, he's born in Bethlehem because that's where his parents live, and ends up in Nazareth because he's in hiding. In Luke, he's born in Bethlehem because his parents have to go there for some bureaucratic malarkey, and ends up in Nazareth because that's where his parents live. And when you put it like that, you can see why these stories exist, and what it is they're trying to explain. Nazareth these days is the largest city in the northern district of Israel. At the time of Jesus, it was an unremarkable town in Galilee. The Gospels frequently refer to Jesus as a man from Nazareth. The stories of his public life are mainly located in Galilee. Indeed, the Jesus movement, which became Christianity, was sometimes referred to by other Jews as the Nazarenes. If it weren't for these two nativity narratives, everyone would quite straightforwardly think that Jesus was from Nazareth. But that's a problem if Jesus is the Messiah of the Jewish faith, as his followers came to believe. There was a prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem these days is a city in Palestine, in the West Bank, just south of Jerusalem. It's an ancient city going back over 3,000 years. In the Hebrew Bible, it's most important as the childhood home of David, the semi-legendary king of Israel, who made his name by killing a big lad called Goliath with a slingshot. It was, and is, traditionally believed that the Messiah would be descended from King David, and indeed both Matthew and Luke give us detailed genealogies, proving that Jesus is of David's royal line. These two genealogies are almost completely different to each other, but let's not worry about that right now. The point is that if Jesus is the Messiah, then he really should have been not only a descendant of David, but also born in Bethlehem, the city of David, according to the prophecy. The trouble is, he isn't Jesus of Bethlehem, is he? He's Jesus of Nazareth. Now, two of the Gospels don't bother about this at all. Mark doesn't give any account of Jesus' early life. He just jumps straight in with Jesus all grown up. John does have a lot to say about the origins of Christ, but it is entirely mystical. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on. He is not bothered with mundane details like childbirth and infancy. But both Matthew and Luke felt that he really ought to have been born in Bethlehem, and they each came up with a story to explain how it was that Jesus of Nazareth was actually born in Bethlehem, royal David city, and all that. The trouble is, they came up with two very different and mutually contradictory accounts. Over time, these got blended together into the nativity story we all know and love, with crowd-pleasing embellishments like the innkeeper and the little donkey. St. Francis of Assisi had quite a bit to do with this. It's said that he created a nativity display in a cave just outside Greccio in Italy for the Christmas of 1223. There was a wax figurine of Jesus, actors playing Mary, Joseph, and all the rest, and some live animals, including a little donkey. His nativity scene was based on Luke's version. But as time went on, people added in the wise men, the gifts, and the star. And over centuries of development in medieval nativity plays, the story as we know it came together, incorporating the blended highlights of both versions. And of course, at a time when most people couldn't read, and masses were said in Latin which most people didn't speak, these visual and dramatic adaptations were the main way that people learned about the stories in the Bible. But okay, we've pulled all that apart and seen that there's not one story but two, and they contradict each other. They can't both be true, but maybe one of them is kind of true, more or less? Well, unfortunately, that's unlikely. Each of these stories has big problems, so much so that mainstream Bible scholars no longer regard them as history at all. Let's take Matthew first. It's absolutely crucial to Matthew's whole narrative that King Herod goes on a murder spree and has a whole load of infant boys killed in an attempt to do away with the new King of the Jews. Not much about the way Matthew presents the story makes much sense. Herod had spies, he had soldiers. He could easily have had the Magi followed or escorted on their way to find Jesus, and then quietly had the boy killed without any fuss. But we don't really have to worry too much about these details, because we can be pretty confident that this slaughter of the innocents just didn't happen. Not that King Herod was exactly a nice guy. The great Jewish historian of this period, Josephus, relates various tales of him murdering people who threatened his power, including his second wife and 3 of his sons. He sounds very much like the kind of guy who would kill a child for political reasons. But the tales we have of Herod come from his enemies, from people who want to paint him in a bad light. Some historians think he's been unduly slandered. But even these enemies, who are determined to portray Herod as a wicked tyrant, don't mention anything about slaughtering a load of infants in Bethlehem, even though that's a far worse crime than anything else he's accused of. Why would they leave that out? It's not as if they wouldn't be aware of it if it had happened. It is the sort of thing that people remember. And yet this incident is nowhere to be found in any Jewish, Roman or Christian writings, apart from Matthew chapter 2. It didn't happen. And without this key incident, the whole of Matthew's story collapses. There is no reason for the Holy Family to flee from Bethlehem, no reason for them to settle down in Nazareth. His whole explanation of Jesus' origin falls apart. So, forget Matthew's story. What about Luke? At first sight, Luke seems more plausible. He certainly includes more historical detail. Unfortunately, it doesn't help. The key part of his story is the census. This is what forces Joseph to take the pregnant Mary to Bethlehem, where they are unable to find a room to stay in. As with Matthew, lots of the details are implausible, like, if Joseph has family in Bethlehem, why can't they stay with them? But the big problem is this census business. The first problem is that he says the census happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius was indeed the Roman governor of Syria, and he did indeed carry out a census. The trouble is, he became governor in 6 AD, and the census took place shortly after he took office. That's 10 years after Jesus was born. These days it's generally accepted that Jesus was born around 3 or 4 BC. We've seen that Matthew tells us that Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod, who died in 4 BC, 10 years before this census. But Luke also tells us some details about when Jesus was born. He tells us that John the Baptist was conceived during the time of King Herod, and Jesus was conceived 6 months later, not 10 years later. And when he later introduces Jesus as an adult, he starts his preaching in the 15th year of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, which is around 29 AD, and says at this time he's about 30-ish, which kind of fits being born around 3 or 4 BC, but not during the census of Quirinius, 10 years later. So Luke doesn't just disagree with Matthew, he disagrees with himself. There's all sorts of other problems with this census of Quirinius. It didn't cover Galilee for a start, only Judea. So people living in Nazareth wouldn't have been affected. And the whole business of having to go back to your hometown is not at all plausible. But the bottom line is that the dates just don't fit. Okay, but maybe Luke got a bit confused and there was some other, earlier census by some other Roman governor, and that's the one that happened when Jesus was born. Well, that doesn't really work either. Under King Herod the Great, Judea was a Roman client state. This meant that Judea paid money to Rome, but was left to deal with its own internal affairs. The Roman emperor didn't have authority to order a census. That changed in 6 AD. Rome annexed Judea. It fell under the control of the governor of Syria, Quirinius, and one of the first things he did was order his famous census. This enraged the Jews, provoking a rebellion led by a guy called Judas the Galilean. They were so angry because this was an unheard of foreign imposition. It had never been done before. So, why does Luke have a census happening 10 years earlier? It's hard to say for sure. It may have just been an honest blunder. When Herod the Great died around 4 BC, round about the time Jesus was born, there were great disturbances in Judea, which forced the Romans to intervene to restore order. Then, 10 years later, there was the rebellion around the census. At a time when not much history was written down, it's possible a writer could confuse the two. Whatever the reason, Luke's dramatic story is entirely driven by an event that just didn't happen. The whole story just falls apart. So, what are we left with? Both Matthew and Luke tried to solve the problem of the Messiah needing to be born in Bethlehem, whereas Jesus was actually from Nazareth. They both tell dramatic stories, neither of which stand up to historical scrutiny. These are not accounts of the actual birth of Jesus. They're fictions, woven together by creative authors. I guess you could ask, does it matter? Both Matthew and Luke are telling stories that express their own ideas of who Jesus was, of the nature of his divine mission. Matthew has a tale of flight from danger with literary parallels to the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Luke has a child born in poor circumstances, immediately recognised by the Jewish people as their coming saviour. People have found profound meaning in these stories for 2,000 years. And a story doesn't have to be true to be meaningful. People find deep emotional and spiritual meaning in Sophocles, Shakespeare, Tolkien. Why not in the infancy narratives of Jesus? And even the traditional nativity tale we have today, with its pick and mix of the edited highlights of Matthew and Luke, with all its charming additions like the innkeeper, the stable, and the little donkey. It's a tale of light, comfort, and hope at the darkest time of the year. There are worse things in the world than that. But if history is what matters to you, and if, after all this, you're still interested in where Jesus was actually born, well, the answer, most likely, is Nazareth. He was Jesus of Nazareth, after all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more, then like and subscribe. And if you want to support me in making more of these videos, then visit my Patreon at the link below for special bonus material and the opportunity to suggest topics for future videos.